Talking about Saturn can be a bit of a downer, but understanding your Saturn placement is very important to help you successfully prepare for and overcome life's biggest challenges. Saturn rules things like heaviness, limitation, restriction, responsibility, and above all else, hard work. In your birth chart, Saturn's placement in the houses shows you exactly what types of challenges you're most likely to face throughout your entire lifetime. Saturn's placement also gives important insight for how to work with its stern, arduous influence to overcome obstacles that might otherwise seem insurmountable. That's why in this video, I'm going to walk you through everything you need to know to understand Saturn's house placement. From the frustrations and challenges that you can expect to face to the positive side of Saturn's disciplined influence in each of the 12 houses. And for those of you who want to learn about all things Saturn, not just the houses, but also Saturn's sign placement, Saturn's aspects to other planets in the birth chart, transits to and from Saturn, Saturn cycles, and so much more, check out my Mastering the Outer Planets series at the link down in the description below, where you're going to learn everything you need to know, not just about Saturn, but about Jupiter, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto as well. Again, the link for that is down in the description below. All right, so let's get into Saturn's influence in all the houses, beginning with the first house placement. People with Saturn in the first house had to learn to be responsible at a very young age. Personal responsibility is very important for those who have this Saturn placement. For some who have Saturn in the first house, you might have had to parent a parent. So you could have had to take on that parenting role for your parent or for both of your parents. You might have had to actually take over the parenting role for your siblings because maybe one of your parents was absent or both weren't around very often. It could be that you had a parent that was very hardworking that had to, work 2 or 3 jobs to support their family. And so you had to take on a lot of those parental roles. Or it could be that a parent passed away at an earlier age and you had to take on more responsibility, or a parent left and wasn't really in the picture. These things are all, potential scenarios, not always the case, but sometimes the case for people who have Saturn in the first house. People who have Saturn in the first house were also rewarded for being very responsible and very hardworking as a child. They would have been rewarded and acknowledged for taking on additional roles and additional responsibilities, even from a very young age. The normal experience for children isn't that, right? And so having to work harder and do more around the house with the family, maybe even having to get a job at a younger age, those types of things are very common for Saturn in the first house. Also, it could be simply that you had one or more parents that were very perfectionistic. Saturn in the first house people tend to be very self-critical and very hard on themselves. They hold themselves to a very high standard. And sometimes that comes from having to take on that role of responsibility early on and always having to be on top of everything. But sometimes it comes from having a parent who is very perfectionistic and who demanded a lot of that person. It's not uncommon to find Saturn first house people who were doing all of the extracurriculars and getting straight A's in all of their classes and also taking on extra responsibilities in the home. Saturn in the first house people often look and act like little old men and little old women when they're very young, and they tend to lighten up and open up and become more jovial and optimistic with age. However, that Saturn energy on the first house always weighs on you, and you can always kind of be a little bit more pessimistic, a little bit more realistic, a little bit more subdued in that way, especially if you don't have other influences that show otherwise. So if you don't have other optimism producing energy in your birth chart, like let's say Jupiter with your natal Mercury or something like that, then you might always be prone to having a more sobering, somber, melancholy disposition and mindset around things. Also, people who have Saturn on the ascendant or in the first house, again, unless otherwise indicated. So if Saturn's in like Sagittarius or like a more optimistic, jovial sign, you do have to take that into account. That's why I recommend the Mastering the Outer Planets series and my Mastering Saturn webinar to get the whole picture. But you can find that people who have Saturn in the first house, when it's uninhibited, they can be a little bit more dry, a little bit more straightforward and serious in their approach to life. And especially upon first meeting them, they come across as very stern and very responsible and very work focused, or very like grounded, or almost too grounded and too caught up in the real world. But once you get to know them and you get to start to understand some of their other placements, you see that they are multifaceted. Another thing with Saturn in the first house that's kind of interesting is that I've found with my clients that they're often born either prematurely or like super late. Like they are 2 or 3 weeks even past their due date, and their mother's waiting, and then finally the baby comes, or they have to, induce labor or something along those lines because it's just taking so long. But often they'll be premature too. So it'll be either that they're born really early or born really late, because Saturn rules time. And it typically delays things, but sometimes it actually does make things kind of come early. And when it does come early, it's a challenge, right? And so think about a child being premature and what that might entail for their health and for the first, few weeks or months of their life. That is going to be a more difficult experience for them. So it's very Saturnian in its nature and its ability to impact the body and impact even the birth experience and the gestation experience. Speaking of which, Saturn in the first house can sometimes, not always, I don't want you guys all to think that you were unwanted in pregnancy, but for some, it can indicate that at some point during the pregnancy, the parents felt burdened by the fact that they were going to have a child, or that the child was unwanted. That doesn't mean that the child is always unwanted. It just could be that they weren't prepared. Finally, with Saturn in the first house, people tend to assume additional responsibilities in order to feel wanted. And that often is the case when there is that period during gestation when the child wasn't actually wanted. It wasn't actually a welcome surprise that, the parents were pregnant with a child. And so they don't know that consciously usually, but they know it subconsciously, because that energy from the parents, they can feel that in the womb. And so the child usually grows up to take on additional burdens and responsibilities in order to feel much more wanted, in order to feel like they have purpose, in order to feel like, they're not some sort of burden on other people around them. They are also tasked with becoming their own inner authority. So they have to be the ones responsible for their own goals, their own outcomes. They do tend to have a very strong sense of self-responsibility, which I really love about Saturn first house people. And they tend to excel in leadership roles because they are so responsible, so long as their Saturn is not like super dysfunctional. So Saturn, let's say in Pisces, where there's not good boundaries, would be excelling in leadership roles, but taking on too much of what your people that you're leading should be doing. Or Saturn in an inconjunction, Saturn retrograde, things like that can shift it. But as long as Saturn's not dysfunctional and this person has really strong boundaries, they can be excellent leaders. So Saturn in the second house brings a mindset that somebody has to work very hard for their money. Nothing is free, and material possessions do not come easy. Usually, they are very frugal and very careful with their resources, and they work very hard to protect their income, their investments, things like that. They can be savers. They can be really good at building wealth for the future, especially later on in life. That's not always the case at the beginning, because they might start out by not having a lot of money. They tend to be more frugal due to past challenging experiences with money in childhood via the parents or early adulthood, or they learn really bad habits and bad mindsets around money, and that prevents them from actually acquiring and keeping their wealth early on in life. But they do tend to learn through their own hard work, their own expertise, their own due diligence to become very good with their money and very good with managing their money. But it does not come easily to them because they're usually not taught good money habits and a good money mindset early on. So this is something that in adulthood, especially around the time of their first Saturn return, they have to learn for themselves and they have to work on for themselves. Nobody's going to come in and do this for them. Saturn in the second house people must learn to be responsible with money and do things the right way and not the fast way. There are no quick fixes. There's no money falling from the sky typically for people who have Saturn in the second house, unless maybe you have other placements that would otherwise indicate it. You have to learn to be responsible, and you have to learn patience and delayed gratification. You have to learn about savings and investments and things like that. You have to, build a 401k or whatever it is you're using for retirement. These are things that come with time and will pay off with age. Saturn in the second house people very often retire with a very good amount of money, and they enjoy a comfortable and stable life in their retirement, because not only do they have the money, they have the funds, they've planned it out, they're planners when it comes to their resources. Again, not always naturally at the beginning, but later on they become very good planners with their resources. And because they've done that, the money's there. And because they know how to work with less, because oftentimes they've had to throughout their life, they are able to survive on all of that and keep it going and to be frugal when they need to, if that is the case. But often they do have a good amount of money and they can leave a pretty good legacy for their children and things like that as well. The other thing with Saturn in the second house people is that they can often become afraid of dealing with their finances. There's this innate unsettled feeling, this innate fear, this innate dread that comes with dealing with money situations, especially early on before they learn truly and fully how to work hard to earn their money and how to work hard to save and invest their money and do the right things with their finances. And so this leads them to avoid looking at their bank accounts. That's very common for Saturn second house people, to avoid getting everything together and their ducks in a row to actually manage their finances appropriately. And it can lead to procrastination when it comes to things like paying bills, even when they do have their money in their bank account in order to do it. And so these are people that need to learn to just deal with it, right? It's not going to get easier until you practice, until you work with it, until you do the thing. And so money matters don't come easily for people with Saturn in the second house, but that doesn't mean that you're doomed. It just means that you have to actually put in the work and face this head on. Saturn in the third house often brings delays and difficulties involving early childhood education. People who have this placement sometimes have issues with like language or reading or writing or mathematics, and it makes them feel inferior to their classmates, or maybe they were even picked on. I've seen examples of Saturn in the third house people who their parents were from a foreign country and they immigrated, and so they had a different accent or they weren't as fluent in the language where they were living, and they were picked on for that. And so it makes them feel fear or anxiety around sharing ideas, around their own intelligence, around speaking out. And so that's something that they have to learn to overcome, because they can actually be very brilliant writers, very brilliant teachers, very brilliant communicators later on in life if they put in the work and if they face their fears, which usually they end up having to do at some point. Sometimes people who have Saturn in the third house have to take on a greater responsibility for their siblings at a young age. And so it could be that their parents worked a lot, and so they were, tasked with taking care or babysitting their siblings. Oftentimes these can be children that were older or maybe the eldest of the siblings. And so because they were, teenagers while their siblings were much younger, they did have to take on a lot of that parenting role, that babysitting, that responsibility for their siblings. This can also bring challenges in sibling relationships. And I've seen this happen quite a bit, where if you have Saturn in the third house or with the ruler of the third house, it can create limitations, restrictions, problems, blockages, obstacles to having a really good, strong connection with your siblings, or with even like cousins, aunts and uncles, extended family members, things like that. But especially it can bring tension and animosity in sibling relationships. On the flip side, if you have Saturn in the third house, maybe you really wanted a sibling, but you didn't have that growing up. And so you're always seeking that sibling relationship through other people in your life. You were always seeking that type of companionship through your peers and your classmates and things like that, because you craved it and you didn't get it. And so that can be something that comes up for Saturn in the third house as well. It does bring a disciplined mindset and great wisdom that can be shared through teaching, like I mentioned before, later on in life. This is a great energy for breaking down and teaching very practical skill sets. So again, like reading, writing, arithmetic, but it doesn't have to be that. Like teaching things that somebody can use very easily in practice, that's in smaller chunks, kind of like a trade or a certification of some kind. This could be something that could be really good for that. It could be really good for writing, especially when it comes to writing things that are more factual. So not necessarily fiction, but nonfiction writing, especially shorter form nonfiction writing. Like so, doing like research papers, grant write-ups or grant requests or whatever you call those. So writing grants, doing things like blogs that are more informational and scientific and very grounded and down to earth. And so things like that can come a lot more easily over time because it is something that you have to work at, but it's something that they can have a talent for as well. Saturn in the fourth house can bring challenges in the early home environment. So oftentimes people who have Saturn in the fourth house had to take on a lot of responsibility for parents or for family members, or maybe even grandparents living in the home early on in life. And that tends to be a trend that comes back up later on as well, where family life feels like a burden. Family life feels like a lot of responsibility. Your home and your home life and maybe even your property feels like a heavy weight that you always have to carry. So like caring for a home. However, people who have Saturn in the fourth house typically do need to own a home. Home ownership can be a big theme. It's something that's very scary, but they feel very pulled toward, and it's something that is a responsibility they have to learn how to take on. It's definitely better for owning than renting. That temporary energy of rentals and like not knowing that you're going to have that stability and longevity and that this isn't going to be your forever home can be so stressful for people who have Saturn in the fourth house. However, owning a home is also a lot of work and responsibility, but you can naturally take to that. It's something that you can learn to do and you can learn to deal with a lot more easily. It's not as unsettling for you. Often people with Saturn in the fourth house had a very disciplined or restrictive upbringing. If it's dysfunctional in any way, so if you have Saturn, let's say retrograde in an in conjunction, negatively placed in a sign it doesn't like to be in, making weird aspects, it can indicate that there were boundary issues in the home and with the family. And so it makes your home life again feel more like work because there were never appropriate boundaries. It was like, who's the parent, who's the role model, who's the person in charge here? I don't know. I don't know what the rules are. The rules keep changing. I don't know what the expectations are. The expectations keep changing. So the boundaries are blurred for some people if their Saturn is dysfunctional, or if they have like Saturn and Pisces, for example. That would be a good example of how that might show up. So Saturn in the fourth house people are prone to staying in really burdensome family situations or living situations way longer than necessary due to a sense of responsibility. And so you might know that your home environment is toxic. You might know that you don't have good boundaries. You might know that living with mom and dad or allowing them to stay with you is not a good idea, or having your adult children move back in is not working for you and it needs to be kind of cut off. However, you're going to be more prone to allowing that to continue for far longer than you should because of that innate sense of responsibility. And so again, this is where boundaries and boundary issues really come into play. So with Saturn in the fifth house, romance, pleasure, and play all feel like a lot of hard work. And so having a boyfriend or a girlfriend, having that love affair, that love relationship can feel like it's a lot more work or it's a lot more trouble than it's worth. The dating scene is usually not for you if you have Saturn in the fifth house. You want something more serious, more responsible, and you're not really wanting to put in that type of effort for something that's just going to be a fling or that's something that's just going to be fleeting. This can also bring sometimes issues with sexuality because the fifth house is the house of sex. And so there could be limitations, restrictions, burdens, difficulties sexually for people who have Saturn in the fifth house. That's not always the case, but it is sometimes the case, especially if you're trying to have like a one-night stand or something that's just more light and more fun. It very quickly turns serious if you have Saturn in the fifth house. The fifth house also rules children. And so Saturn can bring a lot of difficulty around children. Not always the case. Again, you have to look at what Saturn's doing holistically in the birth chart. But children can feel like much more of a burden for people who have Saturn in the fifth house, especially when it comes to the first child. There can be difficulties or delays with pregnancy. There can be a lack of children that can show up with Saturn in the fifth house for some people, either by choice because it feels like such a heavy weight, or by necessity because you're not necessarily able to have children. You'll find with Saturn in the fifth house, especially with women, they might delay having children until a lot later than their peers. And that is one way that this can manifest a lot more positively, because it's kind of like, okay, now I've done this, I've done that, I've gotten all my ducks in the row, I'm financially stable, whatever else you need. And now I can take on this additional burden of childbearing and child rearing, because it is a burden, it is a responsibility, even if it is like a beautiful one for a lot of people. And it's something that people with Saturn in the fifth house really feel like they need to be prepared for. And so they might put off or they might delay if they do decide that they want to have children. This can also indicate sometimes if Saturn is dysfunctional or really problematic in its placement in the fifth house, that there is a limitation, restriction, difficulty around your relationship with your child or your children, where especially maybe in adulthood, you don't get to see them as much. Maybe they live long distance. So even if you have a really positive relationship, a really stable relationship with your child, they live in a completely different country. And so that restricts your ability to connect with them in some way. It could also be, especially if you are not the primary caregiver. So if you are divorced and you have children, you don't get to see them as much as you would like to. And even if you are the primary caregiver and you're the one with your children most of the time, that restriction on seeing them when your children are with their other parent, that can weigh on you quite a lot when you have Saturn in the fifth house. And so with Saturn in the fifth house, it is possible to have a really beautiful, really great relationship with your children, but you do have to just work a little bit harder at it, and you have to let go of any fears or anxieties that prevent you from fully embracing that experience. The other thing too with Saturn in the fifth house that can be a thing is that sometimes people who have this placement have a very big difficulty with letting go and enjoying life. There is a guilt or a fear around experiencing pleasure. So it's kind of like you can't do something that's fun unless it also has a purpose. And so the workaround for this is to do things that you enjoy that also have a physical, tangible, objective purpose. Like, yes, I enjoy, maybe you enjoy knitting or something like that. And it's practical because you get blankets and sweaters and that type of thing. There has to be like a tangible outcome that makes sense for you. Or this is a really great placement for entrepreneurs because it's a really great energy for taking your passions and your creative self-expression and turning that into an actual like tangible business. So it's like you're doing what you love either as a side hustle or as like a career path, and it has an actual purpose and you're earning money from it. For those with Saturn in the fifth house, one of the best ways to deal with this when it comes to just allowing yourself to kick back, relax, and enjoy life is to schedule time to do it. You have to be regimented and disciplined in engaging with things that are fun and beautiful and lighthearted that you like to do, which sounds a little bizarre, but you probably won't do it otherwise. And so that is my big recommendation for Saturn in the fifth house. Saturn in the sixth house brings very self-disciplined, hard workers. So Saturn in the sixth is kind of a decent placement for Saturn when it comes to getting the job done, especially if you're somebody who has your midheaven in the 10th house in whole sign houses. Often you'll have a really nice trine from Saturn in the 6th to your midheaven, which can indicate that, the hard work that you put in, the day-to-day self-discipline that you're very easily able to cultivate because you crave and you thrive on regimented routines when it comes to your day-to-day work life experience. This can pay off tenfold. So it's like having this really beautiful energy around hard work and delayed gratification that pays off when it comes to your ultimate goals and plans, especially when it comes to your career. And that can also be the case if you have planets in the 10th house as well. And so I love this energy for that. It can make it so you're too restrictive and limited in the way that you go about your work, so it can inhibit creativity. And sometimes it can make for someone who's a bit of a workaholic. And so that can sometimes be a bit of an issue for Saturn in the 6th house. When it comes to health, this could go one way or the other. So if your Saturn is really beautifully placed, it's exalted in Libra, it's making a grand trine, it's doing all the good things, this can create stability, longevity, a lot of self-discipline around your health practices like diet, exercise, nutrition, things like that. So it can create good health through hard work and through your own efforts. However, Saturn in the 6th house can also be linked to chronic health issues that are very hard to overcome or that take a lot more work to overcome. If your Saturn is super debilitated, sometimes you might find people who have that type of placement who, despite their best efforts, they have to work 10 times harder to be, just as healthy as the average kind of normal person. And so that's something that can cause a lot of stress and a lot of weight. It's like a burden for them. Again, not always the case. And even if you have that placement, it does not mean that you're going to be unhealthy or that you're going to suffer from chronic health issues. If this is you, you probably already know it. And this only happens if you have a bunch of other placements in your chart that also show this. I just wanted to point that out as a potential because it is one strong indicator. It also brings this perfectionistic energy around your work. So you're going to be somebody who's burning the candle at both ends to get your projects and your things done, but you want them done the right way. You want them done in a way that's like very specific. You're going to be very perfectionistic about the outcomes you create through your work, and you're going to have a hard time actually delegating. And so one of the big tasks for Saturn in the 6th house is to learn to delegate, not just through your career and the work you do there, but in your day-to-day life, in your day-to-day experience, you have a hard time delegating your responsibilities to others. And this can cause a lot of stress, and this can weigh on you when it comes to your health and your physical body. And so you want to make sure that you're having good boundaries with your responsibilities and that you're allowing others to carry some of the weight, even though you want to do it all and be responsible for it all. The final thing I'll say is that you can be very regimented in your health and nutrition and the way you deal with your physical body, which can be one of the best things for good health outcomes. However, sometimes it can be too dogmatic, too rigid, too restrictive when it comes to the way that you eat or the way that you exercise or what you believe about your health. And so that is something that you just want to kind of be aware of. If you are somebody who sticks to a very specific, very rigid diet or a very specific, very rigid exercise routine, and you do everything on like clockwork, very disciplined, there's good to that, but it can also be to the point of missing out on things that could also be really good for you, or doing something even though it's becoming detrimental to your health because it's the thing that you do. So you want to make sure that you're keeping an open mind when it comes to the way that you deal with your health. With Saturn in the 7th house, relationships can be challenging and burdensome, especially early on in life. And this is an especially difficult energy, it seems, for women. Men tend to have a better time with this for some reason. And so with women, you'll see especially that there's this like really strong sense of wanting a relationship, but relationships are just so hard. Relationships always feel like a lot more work when you have Saturn in the 7th house, and it can delay you finding the perfect partner. If you do get married, early on, it's typically way earlier than your peers, and sometimes it doesn't necessarily last. If that's the case, sometimes it will. And if it's positively placed, this could be getting married really early and having this beautiful, long-lasting, because Saturn brings longevity and stability. So it can be this really long-lasting partnership that just stands the test of time. However, if you don't find that early on, that's okay. You're going to be a little bit later than your peers, or than you think you should be when it comes to finding that relationship. But when you do, often it is a very long, withstanding, very stable, very committed, very dedicated partnership, but you do have to work on it. This is an energy about learning to work with your partner and to work on your relationships. You learn that relationships require effort and require work. And once you're able to work on yourself and the relationship, and you learn how to do this process, things can be amazing for you. And you can have that stability, that longevity in relationships that you crave. But for some people who have Saturn in the seventh house, I will say that if your Saturn is super like just challenged and afflicted, and it's just a horrible placement for Saturn for you, it might actually prevent you from having a long-term partnership that lasts, or a marriage partnership, or it can indicate ending up in a long-term partnership that's just bad and it just doesn't feel good for the entirety of the relationship. That's rare. You have to have a lot of stuff going on, but I wouldn't be honest. I wouldn't be being honest with you if I were saying that every single person who has Saturn in the seventh house ends up with this long-term, beautiful, stable partnership. I see it very often, but usually they have to work harder to get there. They might have to go through a few relationships and learn how to put in the work and what they actually need to be doing in order to come to that position. If Saturn is dysfunctional, so if it's in an inconjunction, if it's retrograde, if it's in a watery placement of some kind that blurs the boundaries of Saturn, then it can bring challenges. So it can bring challenges with boundaries in partnership, where you don't know what responsibilities are yours or what boundaries you should be creating in partnership. And sometimes it can bring challenges with raising children as a couple. So whenever you have to take on responsibility as a couple, that can bring its own set of new challenges. However, the best way to work with Saturn, if you have Saturn in your seventh house, is to take on great responsibility together as a couple and to be working very hard toward some sort of goal together. Like, that is the best remedy for Saturn in the seventh house, especially if it's close to the descendant. And so sometimes that can look like raising a child together, because that's a huge responsibility, and putting a lot of kind of focus on that responsibility. The final thing that I should say about Saturn in the seventh house is that you may marry somebody with a significant age difference. For some reason, I see this more commonly with women than with men, but it can go either way. And so that's another thing that comes up with Saturn in the seventh house. So with Saturn in the eighth house, one of the things that I'll commonly see that I think is kind of interesting is this innate fear around death or dying that's way more prominent than it will be for the average person, where it becomes more of a focal point for some reason. Often this is because they had some sort of early experience that involved death or dying, like the death of a loved one or the death of a pet or something like that, that really weighed on them, and it caused them to kind of think very hard about their own mortality and the longevity of the people that they care about and love. And so there can be a lot of like fear, or it's kind of like when people are always worried or always thinking that someone around them is going to die. That's not always the case with Saturn in the eighth house, but you will see that a lot more with Saturn in the eighth house people, because Saturn is fear and the eighth house is the house of death. And even if there wasn't an early childhood experience, it's almost as if this came with them in this lifetime from some sort of prior lifetime experience. That's not really easy to verify if that is the case, but that's kind of the way that I like to think about it, because it does almost seem like something really traumatic happened to them, but they don't recall it, or they can't access it because it didn't happen in the here and now. It didn't happen in this lifeline or this lifetime. Saturn in the eighth house can also bring limitations, hardships, and oppressive energies involving debt and joint finances. This is not a good placement for getting into debt. However, this is a placement where people are very likely to get into debt. And so if you have this placement, don't get credit cards, don't take out loans, try to pay for everything in cash as much as you can, although I'm probably catching you after you've already gotten into debt. In which case, this is going to be an energy of having to work really hard to attain financial freedom. This is not a good energy for getting locked into agreements that involve finances with other people where you are dependent on their money. And so you're going to want to do your due diligence and not avoid paying off your debts. Don't avoid paying off your bills. Don't avoid looking at your credit card statements. Don't just throw out, your mail when those come. Like, you have to actually deal with it, look at it, set up actual like spreadsheets and plans, and talk and negotiate with your creditors. You're going to have to put that effort in, but you can overcome this, and you can actually become very financially well off and very financially intelligent later on in life, especially when it comes to things like making investments. Long-term investments are really good for Saturn in the 8th house people, as opposed to trying to get short-term gratification and short-term gain. If you are somebody who's in partnership, it can be that your joint finances can be a little bit of a burden. And so sometimes your partner has a lot of debt, and that becomes your burden. Sometimes your partner doesn't make as much money as you do, and so you're having to take on more responsibility for finances because of that. And so it really, again, just depends on how this is showing up for you personally. It's not always the case, but it is often the case that joint finances become more of a burden. And so, for most people, it's kind of like natural when you get married to combine your finances. But for you, you need to have some sort of written agreement. You should have a prenup. You should have some sort of financial counseling before joining together with your partner. You should be working very hard each month to kind of get a handle on your finances, make plans, make budgets together. Otherwise, it's not going to work very well for you in practice. And in addition to your financial situation with your partner, there can be a tendency to take on too much burden for other people's financial struggles, especially when Saturn is in some sort of dysfunctional placement. So this is very common, especially with Saturn in an in conjunction, Saturn retrograde, Saturn with like Neptune or in Pisces, or really in any of the water signs, especially Cancer and Pisces, where you don't have good boundaries when it comes to your financial situation and other people's finances. And so that's something that you might have to work a little bit harder on. But in general, if you're putting in the effort, if you're paying close attention, if you are having really good structure and routines around your financial situation, especially in combination with other people, then you're able to, again, do really, really well financially and to acquire a lot of wealth over time, especially through investments and working together with others. People with Saturn in the 9th house are often raised in a very strict religious environment, or if they are born with Saturn in retrograde, it might be the exact opposite. So there was no belief system, there was no sort of boundaries, there was no sort of rules when it came to the way, what you believed and how you believed it and how you practiced your beliefs. And so there could be kind of like this energy of like feeling lost when it comes to religion. But for most people who have Saturn in the 9th house, there was like a lot of religious dogma or a lot of dogmatic beliefs that were kind of thrust on you in early childhood. And you develop different beliefs usually in adulthood as a result of that. Sometimes those beliefs were aligned with yours, and you develop those same dogmatic or rigid belief systems when it comes to not just religion, but also like your philosophy, your ethical value systems, the way that you kind of perceive reality. That can become very rigid and dogmatic, very similar to what you were brought up with. Or you can completely reject that, which is what often happens, and you create your own dogmatic belief systems. And people who have this placement don't believe that they are dogmatic in their thinking. They think that they are right and they're righteous about it, but they don't think that they are closed-minded and dogmatic. And so that could be something that other people see in you, but you might not necessarily see in yourself. And so the challenge here is to become more open-minded when it comes to other people's perceptions of reality, other people's religious and spiritual beliefs, other people's philosophical values, and to allow a little wiggle room for yourself to bring some outside perspectives into the mix. People with Saturn in the 9th house can have delays or interruptions to their higher education. I've seen many, many Saturn 9th house people who either start college and don't finish it, or they have to go back later on, or especially if Saturn's retrograde, they might start college and then have to go and get additional like degrees because they change career paths or something changes in their life later on in life. And so you'll see that coming up for some Saturn in the 9th house people as well. Saturn in the ninth house does make you a really brilliant teacher. A lot of times people who have this placement will avoid teaching others. They feel like it's a huge responsibility, a huge burden. They don't know where to start. But later on in life, they will impart their wisdom, and they'll do so in a way that's very structured, very grounded, very down to earth, very usable. And that is usually very wise. So they do tend to become very good teachers, especially later in life, especially if they're avoiding it early in life and they do it late in life, because not everybody avoids it. Some people take that burden on, and it's kind of like, this is such a heavy weight to impart this wisdom and to trust people with this or whatever it is, but often they'll delay doing it. The final thing that you'll probably see with people with Saturn in the ninth house that's very common, kind of going back to their beliefs, is that there's this constant struggle to find their way when it comes to their deeply held beliefs, when it comes to finding God. Like, that task in and of itself can feel like a huge burden for some. And so that can be part of that experience as well. And also, they do tend to have a more pessimistic or fatalistic worldview. I've noticed that, where they feel like they have less control over what's going on in their lives and in the world around them. Not always the case, but sometimes the case. Saturn in the 10th house often brings delays, challenges, and fears around career and public status. However, having Saturn in the 10th house is a good indicator that you can work really, really hard and achieve a lot. These are typically high achieving people. However, the rewards for your achievements and the achievements themselves might not come until a little bit later in life. This is actually a very common placement I see in women who choose to delay their career goals in order to raise children, stay-at-home moms, for example, where, they feel like they have these big career goals and aspirations, or maybe they don't actually know what they want to do with their career later on, but they do know that they want to work, they want to do something meaningful, they want to put something out there into the world that's going to impact people in some way. But that doesn't come early on. It usually comes after they're done raising their children. After their Saturn opposition, usually in their 40s, they can accelerate their growth in their area of career. Some people who have this placement choose to avoid having a career completely, or they have constant delays, roadblocks, and obstacles that prevent them from fully embracing that energy. However, Saturn in the 10th house can be really great for being very disciplined, very diligent, and working hard toward your goals. And Saturn in the 10th house people need to have goals. They need to have plans. They need to have goals. If they don't have goals when it comes to their career, when they don't have goals when it comes to the way that they're engaging with the world around them, the way that they're impacting the world at large, they feel lost. And so that's something that you should always be crafting and creating. Even if you don't know what the big goals are, having some sort of goals and working toward them in that area can be super helpful, even after retirement. Like, doing something out there in the world that's going to impact others, even after you are no longer, working in your chosen field or career, that can be a huge thing for the happiness and satisfaction of people with Saturn in the 10th house. The other thing too that can prevent Saturn in the 10th house people from achieving what they want to in their career is they can be very perfectionist and hardworking, where they're afraid of putting things out there until it's exactly just right. And so don't dwell too much on having it being perfect. That can be really hard for Saturn in the 10th house people, or else you might not ever achieve anything. Sometimes done is better than perfect, as they say, although you'll have a hard time convincing a Saturn 10th house person of that when it comes to their work and the things that they, share with others in that way. This can also bring difficulties and delays that are caused by challenges and obstacles provided by people in positions of power and authority. So it's kind of like you want to get a promotion, you want to climb the corporate ladder, let's say, but your bosses and superiors keep knocking you down and preventing that from happening. And so that is something that you have to work on. So working on relationships, working on developing very strong foundations for relationships with people who are in positions of power, for creating strong foundations in your relationship with your boss, that can go a long way. It's going to feel like a burden. It's going to feel like hard work. You're not going to want to do it, but when you do it, you can succeed a lot more easily. Saturn in the 11th house can make friendship feel like a lot of work, and it especially can make maintaining friendship feel like a lot of work. Saturn in the 11th house often brings a sense of isolation and challenges in fitting in with the group. People who have this placement tend to keep their social circles small. You want really quality, really dependable, really long-lasting, stable friendships and relationships with other people. You don't want people that are not going to be there for you. You don't want someone who's not going to be your friend 20 years from now. You don't want just a drinking buddy. You want somebody who is going to take this friendship and this connection with you seriously, because you take your friendships and your connections very seriously. You tend to be the one that other people rely on. You're always reliable. You're always showing up for other people. You're always able and willing to take on responsibility and weight to help your friends. And so this is something you take very seriously. And that's why friendship for you is a lot of hard work, because you put a lot of work into it. You put a lot of effort into it. And you expect the same from others. You won't have a friendship otherwise. And so this is a very common thing for just having a few very close, very solid friendships. This is also a good energy for work-related friendships or work-related networking and connecting with other people in that way. That can be very fruitful for you. And, you know, friends that come through work, that's a very common thing. So it could even be very literal that a lot of your friendships come through like the jobs that you've had and things like that. And that can be part of this as well. They also sometimes can be raised around too many adults, which causes a difficulty with relating to people their own age. And so this is a common placement for having friends that are either much older than you or much younger than you. Often it's much older, but sometimes, especially when you get older, it tends to be the opposite, where you crave friendships with people who are much younger, as opposed to, you know, having friendships that are much older than you. So usually you'll see that a lot with people who have Saturn in the 11th house as well. This is also excellent for assuming responsibility and leadership roles within groups. So if you're part of a club or organization, you could be a really great leader. You could take on a lot of responsibility in those groups. And those can also be really great ways to get social connection, because it's kind of like you're working on something together, which is one of the best expressions of Saturn in the 11th house. Finally, Saturn in the 12th house. So Saturn actually has its joy in the 12th house, but it tends to not be very joyful for people who have that. Saturn rejoices there because it aligns with a lot of its malefic significations, and it allows it to express those a lot more easily. And so Saturn in the 12th house often brings an innate sense of alienation. So a lot of people who have Saturn in this placement spend a lot of time in their early life in seclusion, like literally. And that comes up for them time and time again throughout their lifetime, where they're forced to be alone, where they're forced to spend time in solitude, where they're forced to be away from the world for one reason or another. Sometimes that can be because there are challenges and hardships involving 12th house institutions. And so that could be things like hospitals. So I've seen a lot of people who have 12th house Saturn placements who they had a parent or a grandparent or some close family member who was very sick when they were a child. And so they spent a lot of time, you know, in a hospital waiting room. It could also be things like monasteries, temples, ashrams, churches, prisons, prisons, brothels, and rehabilitation centers. And so these are all 12th house institutions where there could be some sort of difficulty involving that Saturn placement. And one of the weirdest things that I see with Saturn in the 12th house is that it's the most common placement that I have found for clients who have been involved with religious cults. Like very literally, this shows up almost every single time. And I've had kind of a weird number of clients that have been involved in religious cults, either in childhood through their family upbringing or through adulthood in one way or another. And this Saturn 12th house placement often comes up for those people because they're kind of forced out of normal society and they're forced into isolation where they're only involved in that cult energy. And that 12th house does have that connection to spirituality. And again, those energies like monasteries and temples and things like that. And so you do find that sometimes. It's not going to be the most common thing in the entire universe, but I have seen it come up enough times where it seems to be a pattern. Saturn in the 12th house usually indicates that there's a lot of past life karma being worked through in this lifetime. And so for this placement, a past life regression, any type of hypnosis can be very healing and very powerful for these people. There can be a lot of fear also connected to loss and abandonment because that is something that comes up early on in life. And so this is a placement where you have to work really hard to learn to be on your own sometimes. And that can also become an energy where you learn to enjoy it. That's where you do your best, deepest inner work. People who have Saturn in the 12th house tend to be very disciplined with their spirituality. They tend to have a lot of spiritual practices that they like to engage with. And that's one of the ways that they indulge in that energy positively, as opposed to, being forced into seclusion, being forced into this energy of kind of like loss and losing themselves and having to find themselves again. It's kind of like an intentional practice that they're doing, where they're diving deeper and digging deeper. This is a great energy too for you to learn something like hypnosis or past life regression hypnosis. It doesn't have to be past lives, but it can be, anything that really taps into and works with the subconscious and the unconscious realms and realities. If you can do that as a practice for yourself, but also help other people by doing that, that would be a really great way to use that energy of that spiritual work, of that unconscious work, really productively with Saturn in your 12th house. The final thing I've noticed with Saturn in the 12th house is that sometimes there can be this responsibility for keeping secrets for other people, or even your own secrets, that just weigh really heavily on you. For some reason, you are the keeper of everyone's burdens and secrets, and you do good at it. And it's probably why they know that they can trust you not to let it out and put it out there. But you have to learn to have really good boundaries when it comes to those things, because you don't want to always know what you have to know. You don't always want to have to keep this thing from somebody else. And so, being responsible with which secrets you take on and which ones you don't. And maybe, in small bits and pieces, working on letting go of some of those secrets you're carrying for yourself or for your family or something like that, where it's just not necessary to keep this a secret anymore. And once you let it out, that weight just sort of lifts out of you and off of you. And that is the 12 houses of Saturn. So let me know down in the description below, where is your Saturn placed? What house is it in? Has any of this resonated or rung true for you, or is your experience different in some way? Let me know how you've experienced Saturn in the houses in your own life and in your own chart. And thank you so much for watching. Again, make sure you subscribe to this channel so you never miss an important tutorial or astrology update. Share this video with a friend if you feel like they could benefit from learning about their Saturn placement, and I will see you in the next one. Bye, everyone.